Namaste and pranam everyone. Welcome to our third class on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Today we're going to see Sutra number 3 and 4. Before we begin, let's start with an opening prayer. Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakarotam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjalim ranatosmi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Beautiful. All right, so let's take a look at Sutra number 3, which is essentially Tada drashtuhu swarupe vasthanam. Tada drashtuhu swarupe vasthanam. Okay, so tada basically means then. Drashtuhu means seer. So it's originated from the word drishti. Seer here refers to the witnessing consciousness that's within us. The ability to step back and look at ourselves from the outside in. That is what a seer here is referring to. Swarupe, one's own essential nature. And avasthanam. So when we split the word, it's swarupe and avasthanam. When we say it together, it's swarupe vasthanam. Avasthanam basically means establishing or establishment. So here, this sutra is talking about what are the outcomes or benefits of going through the process of yogaschitta vritti nirodha. So when Patanjali Maharishi says, then the seer is established or abides in his own nature, which is essentially what the sutra means, he's talking about, when he's saying then, he's referring to all the practices that we discussed in our last class as part of Sutra number 2, right? So when we go through the exercise of transcending the vrittis, or stopping or culminating the vrittis through our yoga sadhana and other sadhana practices, we are essentially creating a bit of a void. We are going through a process of pratyahara. Okay? So for us to understand this more deeply, I want to share an image that I created to talk about what the witnessing consciousness is. So I'll share my screen. What you're seeing here on the top half of the image is the ego, or the little me, as I'm calling it, which is all of our emotions, right? So being happy, being sad, being angry, etc. And then there's the bigger me, or the witnessing consciousness. So in the first part of the image, or as we see ourselves today, a lot of us see this witnessing consciousness as an equal part to the other aspects of our ego, to all the reactive aspects of our ego. But through yoga sadhana, what we're doing essentially is expanding this witnessing consciousness, the bigger me, which then is watching, embracing, and accepting the smaller me. So if you look at the words that I've written at the bottom, I've intentionally mentioned watching. So that is one of the functions of this witnessing consciousness, is it observes. It doesn't get caught up in the crux of the situation. It's able to take a step back, remove itself, or put distance between what's happening with the ego and observe from the outside in. So it watches, it embraces. So this witnessing consciousness is a very loving and compassionate, non-judgmental aspect of us that we sometimes, don't pay much attention to because we're not aware of it most of the time. But as we do our sadhana and the more awareness we create around this witnessing consciousness, we start to realize how compassionate it is. So it's embracing all these aspects of our ego or the inner me, and it accepts us for who we are. When we do yoga sadhana, we go through a lot of changes in our behavior, in our mindset, in how we interact with the external world, in how we think about life. And oftentimes on that journey, we're very hard on ourselves, because we're trying to go somewhere and there are a lot of these roadblocks and all of these vrittis that come up. We talked about chitta in our previous class, so that sum total of consciousness, unconscious, subconscious, and our conscious minds brings up a lot of things. And it's not just because of our conditioning that happens in this lifetime, right? We're all conditioned as we are raised to think a certain way, to have the goals we have. We're conditioned to be who we are. And some of it is good and some of it doesn't serve us. But a lot of this conditioning is also accumulated from previous births, from previous karmas that sometimes come up. So, if you're ever in a situation and wondering, why did I say that, or why did I react that way, or there's a compulsive side to you, it is essentially a reinforcement of all of our habitual tendencies that have accumulated, not just with this lifetime, but over lifetimes. This witnessing consciousness, when it grows and expands and embraces and accepts all these aspects of our lives, there is a non-judgment or an unbiased existence with our ego. So what happens then is the weight of these emotions and the weight of these problems and the weight of these situations and complexities in our lives on ourselves drastically diminishes. It becomes so small that it doesn't affect you anymore, right? So that is what we're trying to do with yoga sadhana. We are trying to expand this witnessing consciousness. So what is this exercise helping us do? This exercise of expanding the witnessing consciousness. What it's doing essentially is it's creating a void through the process of pratyahara. So if we remember from our earlier classes, we talked about Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, or the 8 stages of existence or yoga that Patanjali Maharishi talks about, right? So Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, right? So Pratyahara falls squarely in the middle. So it goes through the first few stages that we just talked about. These are all the Bahiranga practices or the external practices of yoga. And then we go into Pratyahara, which is the sense withdrawal, which then leads us into Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi, which are the Antaranga practices or the internal practices of yoga. So Pratyahara is very important to create that void and create that space which you can then fill with what is required to take you to these higher realms of self-realization and higher realms of consciousness and the ability to essentially perceive a more subtle or esoteric truth. And the reason this is important is because in our day-to-day lives, if we are trying to understand what this is, whether it's you trying to understand God or you trying to understand the universe or nature or how it works, we're doing that with our gross senses. It's not the faculty that helps us perceive such a subtle esoteric truth. We need to develop a faculty within ourselves to then be able to experience these more subtler truths, or to get into self-realization or the Kaivalya state. So this faculty, right, it starts with the Antakarna. It starts with divinizing the Antakarna. So when we talk about the Antakarna, the Man, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankar, we talked about it in the last class as this Buddhi being that entity that can make sound decisions for you, for the ego or the Antakarna to execute. But it's getting all of this information from the Man and the Chitta, right? Sorry, Man and the Chitta. So the Man, whatever we see, when we see something, we desire it. The man says, I must have it. The mana says, I must have it. You may or may not be able to afford it, you may or may not need it, but you have all these desires that come up. It's the man interacting with the outside world. And then there's the chitta that brings up all of these subconscious, unconscious desires, feelings, etc., that essentially come up and feed into the buddhi. Now, the buddhi, when divinized, when the light of awareness and consciousness penetrates through the buddhi, it's able to make sound decisions. It's able to then direct the ego or the ahankar to act in a way that is aligned with your truth. So that is the purpose of expanding this witnessing consciousness. And the third sutra is talking about what happens when we follow the Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha. Now, when we move on to the fourth sutra, which is Vritti Sarupya Mitaratra. Vritti Sarupya Mitaratra. Okay, so Vritti meaning modification or pattern, as we talked about. Sarupyam meaning to identify. And Itaratra is in the other state. Okay, so essentially this sutra is saying when we don't do Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha, we end up identifying with our own vrittis, with our own patterns. So just like when we're in a movie theater, we're watching a movie, we're completely caught up in the emotions of the characters, right? What they're portraying, the actors on screen. But once the movie's over, we're done. We're done crying, or we're done laughing. We're back to our, neutral state. So we end up identifying ourselves with a lot of patterns, with a lot of reaction, with a lot of compulsive actions that we go through in our lives. So essentially, the sutra is talking about how to disengage or dislodge from that state through this witnessing consciousness. And that is the type of yoga that Patanjali Maharishi is asking us to follow. Because we all have different temperaments, we all have different mind stuff, chitta, that comes up. It is very important that for all of us who are trying to perceive that higher truth, we're able to disengage and create that space to then step back and say, I am not just a mother or a daughter or a wife or a sister. I am not just a CEO or a manager or a doctor or whatever it is, whatever your titles are at work. You are beyond that, right? You are beyond the roles that you play in your day-to-day life. So this is an overview of the two sutras that we looked at today. So as part of homework, since in the last class, for those who are doing these assignments regularly, you would have gone through an exercise of self-analysis, identifying, how your mental state was between a sattva, rajas, and tamas throughout your day. Now that is the foundation for you to understand where you usually trip up, or who and what maybe triggers a certain guna in you, or a certain thought pattern in you. And this could just be something that's self-originating, right? Maybe there are certain things that you do during your day that make you feel a certain way that doesn't serve you. So now that you've identified, now that you've gone through the exercise of identifying, in our next homework or next assignment, we're going to use those opportunities to bring in the witnessing consciousness. So as an example, every time, let's say, you get upset, use that opportunity to then question who is getting upset. Bring in that ability to step back and understand, okay, that's something I do, especially when I go through my relationships and there are things that I find hard navigating. The question is always, is it really that person, or is it something about me that I need to address more deeply so that what they say or what they do doesn't impact me? because they're not maybe doing it consciously to hurt me, right? So this is just an example of being able to bring in that witnessing consciousness and making changes to your life. So as you go through this homework, I would love to hear from all of you in the next class. One, in terms of how this has changed how you interact with the world outside, but also would love to hear how the world is responding to you. Because if you're doing this exercise seriously and we're doing these assignments, you will notice a change in how the world, the external world, your relationships at your work, at home, whatever, responds to you. Okay? So with this, we'll wrap up our class today. Namaste. Thank you very much.